Delicate and sweet text. The mutual redemption of a solitary blind girl and a deep and melancholy CEO, Xia Zixi has been blind for almost a year now. The idea of escaping the Xia family has become increasingly strong in her mind this year. So within less than 3 days of their first blind date with Xu Tingce, Xia Zixi quickly obtained a certificate from him. On the wedding day, a gourd-eating Big V passionately spoke online. Another fake couple from a wealthy family. How many merits has this blind man accumulated in his previous life? Will he marry this extremely wealthy and handsome person in this lifetime? White blind Mr. Xu has this face, his wife is not lucky to look at it. The next day, De V was brutally banned and was also presented with a lawsuit. De V looked innocent and said, "I'm just talking. There's no need to use legal means, right?" A representative of a certain CEO smiled and said, "Mr. Xu said, Xia is a warning to the 100. After hearing about her gossip, Xia Zixi carefully asked someone. "Did he offend you?" Xu Tingce. "He cursed you." Xia Zixi. "Did he curse at me?" She really can't see it. Xu Tingce remained silent for a moment, with a slightly displeased tone. "He cursed you for being unlucky." Xia Zixi. "I thought that if I married Xu Tingce, who was also diligent in writing, I would be able to live like this without disturbing each other." Unexpectedly, Xu Tingce spent money, time, and energy, silently and brutally breaking through all the obstacles between them, walking into her heart through the stars and moon. After regaining her sight, Xia Zixi ignored the warning in someone's eyes and pinched their cheek, asking, "Did you have a premeditation for me? Speak up. Why were you so decisive when you married me?" Xu Tingce coldly patted away her mischievous hand and said, "I thought you were quiet." Xia Zixi. "Down. Must be knocked down. Give him some color to see." Keywords of the novel. After the flash marriage, she and Mr. Xu's love and affection are both unquestionable with no pop-ups. After the flash marriage, she and Mr. Xu's love and affection are both unquestionable with no pop-ups. Download the complete text. After the flash marriage, she and Mr. Xu's love and affection are both unquestionable with no pop-ups. Read the latest chapter. Chapter 1. Blind and Mute Blind Dates. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Blind and Mute Blind Dates. On weekday afternoons, there aren't many people in the coffee shop, and the romantic jazz music makes the atmosphere more elegant and comfortable. This is the 15th jazz song that Xia Zixi heard after sitting down in the coffee shop. She reached out her hands and cautiously groped forward on the table to reach for the coffee cup, then picked it up and took a small sip. There is very little coffee left in the cup. Today is her first blind date, and after her friend came here with her, she left because of an urgent matter. It took her about 3 songs before she felt someone sitting down across from her. During the next 10 songs, the faint smell of coffee mixed with men's perfume lingered on her nose, which was very reassuring. Xia Zixi sat quietly for 12 songs, waiting for the other person to speak. She waited until the 15th song in the store finished playing. The two of them sat quietly here for 15 songs, and the waiter added lemon water twice on the way. During this time, she thanked the waiter but didn't hear the person from the other side talking. Is it mute? The doubts in Xia Zixi heart gradually became real. She held a coffee cup in both hands and squeezed it against her chest. Although she couldn't see anything, her head couldn't help but feel a bit tilted forward. "Excuse me, are you Xu Tingce?" A simple syllable came from the opposite side. "So. Are you satisfied with me?" Xia Zixi swallowed her saliva. There is a moment of silence in the air. Xia Zixi's lips twitched slightly, and her joy was immediately suppressed. She has one last question left. "Are you willing to marry me?" A long period of silence. Xia Zixi's face stiffened slightly. It's a bit inappropriate to ask someone these questions the first time we meet. Xia Zixi was about to open her mouth and apologize, but she didn't expect another voice from across the street. A crisp and concise answer. It's not an upward tone of questioning, nor a trembling tone of shock. Subsequently, the atmosphere fell silent again. The CAFA began playing the 17th song, this time a light and pure piano music. Xia Zixi thinks this song is very pleasant to listen to, more enjoyable than the elegant and romantic jazz music before. She picked up the coffee cup on her chest again and carefully lowered her head to sip it, only to find that the coffee was gone. A regular sound of footsteps came from far to near. "Young master, it's time." Butler Wu bowed respectfully and stood in the middle of the two. Xu Tingce closed his notebook, covered the pen, and clipped it back into the pocket on the chest of his suit jacket. He raised his hand to look at his watch, and the second hand passed by the number 12. This also means that he has been at this coffee shop for exactly an hour now. Xu Tingce stood up, holding his notebook with one hand and buttoning his suit with the other, as he looked at Xia Zixi, who was slightly frightened by his actions and moved backwards. She has a pair of big eyes, with long and thick eyelashes that tremble slightly like a fan, but her eyes are like cotton or clouds, hollow and soft. Her delicate white fingertips caress the coffee cup, and the back of her hand, due to the force of her fingertips, is so white that it can reveal purple blood vessels. She seems to have something to say. Steward Wu looked ahead, but Yu Guang paid attention to Xu Tingce, who had been standing still, feeling puzzled. The young master has always been decisive in his work, and he doesn't understand why he is standing still like this now. Xia Zixi's nose still lingered with a familiar scent, knowing that Xu Tingce had not left yet. But she also knew that there was an additional middle-aged man by their side. Time passed by minute by second, and Xia Zixi was still hesitating whether to schedule his next meeting, but he never dared to speak again. "Let's get married. This is my first time riding in Yinchi, and I hope everyone will enjoy it." End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Is a chess piece, not a wife. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 is a chess piece, not a wife. After hearing him speak, Xia Zixi was somewhat surprised. His voice is like the spring water of a mountain stream, clean and clear, cold and refreshing. He can speak, he is not mute. Xia Zixi had a moment of joy, but it immediately turned into surprise again. Did he just say that he wants to marry himself? Is he willing to be with her even if he's not mute? He doesn't mind if she can't see it. Xu Tingce stood tall and looked down at Xia Zixi's ever-changing expression. Steward Wu was still immersed in what Xu Tingce had just said, his eyes filled with both heartache and shock, his expression complex, and he couldn't calm down for a long time. "Okay." After a long time, Xia Zixi slowly uttered this word. Making this decision, Xia Zixi knew that she was making a big gamble. But she has no other way out. Because she has already reached the end of her life. The familiar smell at the tip of the nose slowly dissipated with the steady and distant footsteps, and Xia Zixi knew that he had left. Xia Zixi asked the coffee shop waiter to help take a taxi before returning home. She called Xia Minglang, "He's not at home." This also means that this family has returned from its ugly and ruthless appearance to its original purgatory-like appearance. Xia Zixi clenched the blind cane in her hand and carefully distinguished the footsteps of those around her. A familiar sound came from the second floor. How about blind dates? Xia Zixi's face turned cold, and her strength increased slightly. She quickly swept her blind cane left and right, and took small steps to sit down in front of the sofa. "You're blind, not mute." The voice suddenly came in front of Xia Zixi. She instinctively lowered her head, tightened her head, but was still fiercely pinched on the cheek by the person who came. "Not bad, we will get married," Xia Zixi replied calmly, enduring the pain. "Can't you? Even blind people. It seems like you're really not picky," Xia Yihan said with an exaggerated tone and a smile. You can leave here and marry into the Xu family, the first tycoon in E country. How about that? Are you secretly happy now? Well, I'm very happy, Xia Zixi replied stiffly. Xia Yihan seemed very satisfied with what she heard, so she let go of her hand and sat next to Xia Zixi, hugging her shoulder and gloating beside her. You, the daughter of a mistress, have indeed taken advantage of being the eldest son of a legitimate family. But don't blame me for not reminding you, this Xu Tingce is the son that his father hates the most. He has been exiled by the Xu family for the third time, the first time in country M, the second time in country A, and now in our country. There is nothing, a single headquarters building in Beijing in a virtual title of Asia-Pacific CEO, just want to take root in our country and open up the market. Do you think it's possible? Not very likely, Xia Zixi answered according to Xia Yihan's words. She knew that when the Xu family proposed to marry their family, her father had originally planned to marry Xia Yihan. Xia Yihan is a very strong girl. She has the most tolerance for sand in her eyes and wants the best of everything. When she knew she wanted to get married, she specifically sent someone to investigate the internal origins of the Xu family abroad, and then refused her father's arrangement without a trace. Dad didn't want to save face for the Xu family again, so he used himself to excuse this blind date. Therefore, she was already mentally prepared to be humiliated and accepted any flaws that ordinary people could not tolerate. So, what Xu Tingce wants is not a wife at all. He wants a chess piece that can connect the upper echelons of Beijing, take root in Beijing, open up our country's market, and show loyalty to his father who hates him. Xia Yihan pinched Xia Zixi's face hard, and you, the daughter of the mayor of Beijing, you are his most satisfied chess piece. End of this chapter. Chapter 3 is just about mutual utilization. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 is just about mutual utilization. If he can't achieve results in Beijing, he can only nod and beg for mercy like a dog. And you can only smile with him and let him vent his anger. Xia Yihan watched Xia Zixi's slightly bleak face and said with satisfaction, even if he achieves results, his father will not let him establish a solid foundation. His ending is still like before, like a homeless stray dog being exiled again. You can only follow him, forever enduring the hardships of fighting the rivers and mountains, but cannot enjoy the blessings of guarding the rivers and mountains. So Xu Tingce didn't hesitate to propose the reason for marrying him. Was that right? Xia Zixi smiled lightly, suddenly feeling that her apologies had diminished a lot, and her heart, which had always been hanging, had also calmed down. It's pretty good, at least I know he shouldn't have any motivation to back out anymore. And he is also using himself. It's almost even now, isn't it? What are you laughing at? Xia Yihan frowned and looked at her discontentedly, vigorously pulling at Xia Zixi's long hair with one hand, forcing her to look up and show her entire expression. I'm laughing, maybe I was born with a low life. Xia Zixi and Xia Yihan have been together for more than 10 years, knowing how to say something to make themselves suffer less. You know it's good, don't always think about things you don't deserve, understand? Xia Yihan stroked Xia Zixi's soft black hair from top to bottom. Xia Zixi naturally understood who she was referring to as someone she couldn't match. Xia Yihan's mood improved, so she naturally let go of her. After Xia Zixi returned to her narrow room, she skillfully touched her desk, put on her headphones, and immersed herself in a world where only sound was her favorite. Until Xia Minglang returned, everything in the luxurious villa was quiet and peaceful, like a calm sea. Zixi, our parents have already agreed to your marriage with Xu Tingce, Xia Minglang said casually while flipping through the city evening newspaper at the dinner table. The wedding is scheduled for next weekend, October 12th. Before that, you two young people, take some time to get your marriage certificate. Xia Zixi's action of picking vegetables was slightly taken aback. So fast her lips stiffened slightly, and even though her eyes were empty, they were filled with sadness. She should be happy to finally leave this purgatory like home on earth, shouldn't she? But why? My heart felt like it had been overturned with bitter water, surging with an indescribable bitterness that choked up in my throat and couldn't be swallowed. She doesn't seem happy. Xia Yihan raised the corner of her mouth and fanned the flames. Zixi, you know your own situation. Xia Minglang shook the newspaper, folded it a few times, and put it in the servant's hand, looking at his little daughter. As if nothing had happened, she gently touched the dish with her chopsticks. After hearing a crisp sound, she carefully inserted her chopsticks into the dish, so that she could pick up a chopstick of food and slowly put it into her mouth. Your eyes have been like this for almost a year now, and the doctor has also warned you that after the best treatment period of 6 months after injury, it will only become increasingly difficult to regain sight. The Xu family is a good place to go, and your father has put in a lot of effort for you. What else can you complain about? Xia Minglang asked himself with a clear conscience. He didn't lack her food or clothing, and he also cared a lot about her in his daily life. As a father, he was already fulfilling his responsibilities. Xia Minglang's words pierced Xia Zixi's heart like needles. Friends who like it, please remember to collect it. Pen refill, end of this chapter. Chapter 4. Counting the Days of Leaving. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Counting the days of leaving. She put down her chopsticks, followed the silk tablecloth with her hand, touched the glass water cup on her right side, took a sip of warm water, and finished the dinner. I don't have anything to complain about, you gave me everything now, right? Xia Zixi said calmly, I'm full now, I'll go upstairs first. Xia Yihan slammed his chopsticks onto the table with a loud bang. What do you mean by that? Are you blaming me for making you blind? Xia Zixi was stunned for a moment and grabbed the handrail of the stairs, suppressing the trembling of her palms. Xia Zixi, you will soon be able to leave this haunted place. Don't be afraid. She didn't say anything, touching the handrails of the stairs with both hands and cautiously walking step by step over the stairs. Dad! Xia Yihan frowned and shouted, look at her. She's not married yet, so she's so arrogant. You need to restrain yourself a bit. Xia Minglang also patted the table and scolded, you know what's going on with her eyes the most. Don't be cheap and act good. She's getting married soon, and you won't be bothering me for these few days anymore. Please be calm these days and don't cause any trouble for me. Do you hear me? Xia Yihan was mentioned as feeling guilty and glared at Xia Minglang. After snorting, she reluctantly went upstairs. Perhaps due to being warned by Xia Minglang, Xia Yihan has not been in trouble with Xia Zixi for the past 2 days. It was Tuesday, and Xia Minglang told her before leaving that the Xu family would come to pick her up today to apply for her marriage certificate and try on her wedding dress. After Xia Minglang left, Xia Zixi sat on the lawn outside, holding her identification documents and tirelessly listening to the roaring sound of cars running over the road. Although she couldn't see it, she could feel that today's sun should be particularly bright. The warm sunshine made her whole body warm and her eyes bright black. Xia Zixi wrapped her arms around her knees, her chin lightly resting on them, and the cotton fabric gently caressed her skin without piercing anyone at all. Time was gradually counted by her. Finally, she heard the sound of a car stopping near the villa. Xia Zixi eagerly opened his big eyes and carefully discerned the direction of the footsteps. It's walking towards her. Xia Zixi supported the soft lawn, grabbed a blind cane, and stood up carefully from the ground. Miss Xia. Steward Wu was somewhat shocked by Xia Zixi's hearing. I'm here to pick you up and apply for a marriage certificate with the young master. I'm ready. Xia Zixi handed over her documents to the direction where the voice came from. Is there anything else I need? Wu Butler took Xia Zixi's ID card from her hand and saw the photo on it. An idea unconsciously popped up in his heart. The young master's future wife has a pair of beautiful talking eyes. It's really a pity. Steward Wu stared at the young girl in front of him with a scattered and unfocused gaze, feeling a surge of heartache. Not lacking. Butler Wu put the documents back in Xia Zixi's palm, raising his hand and wondering if he should put it down. Madam, do you need me to lead you onto the car? After a moment of confusion, Xia Zixi shook her head and said, No, I can keep up with you. The Butler Wu slowed down his pace and walked back 3 steps at a time. Xia Zixi followed the footsteps of Butler Wu and moved her blind cane. After walking a distance, the blind cane hit a hard metal object and made an irregular, clacking sound. Xia Zixi retracted her blind cane, carefully felt the outline of the car, and then sat inside. A familiar smell of boy's perfume penetrated her nose. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Couples with Equal Standards. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Couples with Equal Standards. It's him. Xia Zixi pursed her lips tightly, and for a moment, her hands were somewhat bewildered as she pinched the blind cane, kneading and spinning it. The car door was closed by someone, and in the enclosed body of the car, Xia Zixi not only heard various internal warning sounds, but also heard uninterrupted keyboard tapping. He is in the office. Are you so busy? Xia Zixi wanted to say hello to him, but was afraid of disturbing him. So along the way, no one in the car said a word, and they quietly arrived at their destination. Although it is a workday, it still does not hinder the crowds in front of the Civil Affairs Bureau. As soon as she got out of the car, the laughter, playfulness, and brawls of men and women around her were constantly amplified several times. Xia Zixi stood nervously in the crowd, not knowing where she was going or where the 2 of her companions were now or going. She only had her hands tightly gripping the blind cane that was stuck on the ground. In the outside world, the blind cane is her only sense of security. A strong warmth suddenly covered the back of her hand, making Xia Zixi grip the blind cane even more tightly. And the force still refused to give up, adding to the cleverness and separating her left hand from the blind cane. The familiar scent that lingered on the tip of her nose once again made Xia Zixi relax for no reason. Her hand was wrapped in his warm palm, and he led her towards the place with the loudest noise. The car was still parked at the entrance of the Civil Affairs Bureau, and Butler Wu sat in the passenger seat, looking at the newlyweds walking hand in hand towards the bureau. Since getting in the car, the 2 of them haven't had any communication. Now we all need to take ID photos together, and the 2 can still do it without saying a word. I thought the young master was already dull and quiet enough, but I didn't expect his future wife to be on par with him in this aspect. Butler Wu's mind had already begun to imagine how boring it would be for these 2 people to live together. In the photography room, in front of a whole red screen, Xia Zixi and Xu Tingce stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the camera. Newcomers, please look at the camera and have a brighter smile. The photographer scratched his head and repeated this sentence for the 5th time. Xia Zixi couldn't understand why the corners of her mouth were almost reaching her temples, and the cameraman was still not satisfied. She suppressed the sourness on her cheeks in order to maintain her smile and smiled harder. Sir, you can try to smile happily. The cameraman saw that the corners of the girl's mouth were beginning to twitch, and finally couldn't help but nod at the boy beside her. Xu Tingce frowned slightly and then continued to try to make himself look happier. Ah. The photographer looked at the fake smile of the boy in the camera and finally lost. He sighed, forget it, boy, don't laugh anymore. Growing into his appearance, what can he do without smiling, still defeat the wedding photos of the vast majority of newlyweds? Xu Tingce immediately turned cold, and his aloof demeanor immediately enveloped him again. Xia Zixi. Should someone laugh or not? After completing the marriage procedures from the Civil Affairs Bureau, they quickly moved to a wedding dress shop. The wedding dress shop was very quiet, and from the moment she walked into it, Xia Zixi never heard the noisy voices again. Xia Zixi opened her mouth, wanting to say that she could actually leave on her own, but she didn't know how to speak. She could only be wrapped in Xu Tingce's palm and slowly moved towards her destination. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Difficult to wear beautiful wedding dress. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. The source has no content or has errors. Chapter 7. Couples who cherish words like gold. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Chapter 7. Couples who cherish words like gold. Xia Zixi grabbed the hair she had pulled to the left with one hand and unconsciously pressed down on the wedding dress on her chest with the other. Behind him came the sound of him taking a step closer. Immediately after, the silk on the back was pulled to the right and left in a regular pattern, entangled and tied tightly. Occasionally, his slightly cold fingertips would run over her spine, causing her to unconsciously tremble. The beating of her heart connected to her pulse, running through her body and being amplified uncontrollably. In the narrow fitting room, the faint and imperceptible breathing of the two intertwined, like the regular interlacing ribbons of a wedding dress, one shallow and one deep, one coming out and one coming in. Until her back was completely fastened and the sound of footsteps coming from behind, Xia Zixi slowly moved her hand away from her chest. From far to near, there were also hurried footsteps of high heels stepping on the ground. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Xu. Could you please do it yourself?" The female salesperson looked at Xu Tingce inexplicably, evading her gaze and expressing her apologies urgently. As soon as Xia Zixi turned around, she didn't have time to get the blind cane she had placed in the corner when she heard the girl running around. Immediately after, she carefully helped me out of the fitting room. Both arms were exposed naked in the air, and Xia Zixi felt a bit uneasy as she covered her forearms with her palms. Her forearms are not beautiful, with many scars from cigarette burns on them. "Mrs. Xu, you look as beautiful as a fairy in this wedding dress. As for some flaws on your arms, you don't have to worry. This wedding dress has hand sleeves, and you won't be able to see them when you wear it on your wedding day." Xia Zixi nodded. The atmosphere then fell back into silence. The shop assistant's palms were sweating nervously, but due to professional needs, she had to maintain a smile. Mr. Xu and his wife are really stingy with words like gold. The female shop assistant then looked at Xu Tingce again, only to find that he was still standing straight, his gaze slightly downward, staring at the area covered by Xia Zixi's hand, with a cold expression that was completely beyond one's guess what he was thinking. "Mrs. Xu, are you still satisfied with this wedding dress?" Between Xu Tingce and Xia Zixi, she ultimately chose to pick a soft persimmon. Xu Tingce watched as she remained motionless, pursing her lips and nodding, with a hint of confusion in her eyes. "Mr. Xu, what about you?" the female clerk spoke cautiously. Xu Tingce stared at Xia Zixi, and after a moment, he looked away as if he didn't care, then nodded slightly. The female shop assistant finally breathed a sigh of relief. It's really not easy to greet these two silent VIPs. After trying on the wedding dress, they were respectfully measured in the same place. When she returned to the back seat of the car, her blind machine also announced the time of her appearance on time. Exactly 4 p.m. on October 8th. Wu, the butler, stayed at the wedding dress shop and instructed some things not to come out. The driver, for some reason, just got off the car. The whole car was left with only her and Xu Tingce sitting quietly, waiting. They don't seem to have much communication today either. The sound of typing on the keyboard is intermittent. She moved her buttocks bit by bit and turned to her side. The keyboard sound suddenly disappeared. "Yes." Xia Zixi's voice trembled slightly as she tightly gripped her blind cane and placed it horizontally on her thigh. "Are you going back?" Xu Tingce stared into her eyes. This was the third time he saw a pleading expectation in her unfocused eyes. The first time at the coffee shop, she held a coffee cup and looked ahead, hoping for her answer. The second time on the lawn, she heard the sound of his car coming to a stop and looked at his head, her eyes almost overflowing with anticipation. "Happy New Year to everyone." Wishing you all good financial luck and success in your dreams. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Unstoppable Expectations. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Unstoppable Expectations. This time, she asked him if he was going back, but he was also looking forward to it. Looking forward to parting. Xu Tingce replied, his voice unable to hear joy or anger. Immediately after, the crackling sound of the keyboard filled the car body again. Yu Guang caught a glimpse of her complex expression. Anxiety and unease, forced fake laughter, and disappointment hidden in the eyes. His slender fingers suddenly stopped typing on the computer keyboard, and his gaze fell on her face before moving away. What's wrong? Xu Tingce glanced at the data analysis on his computer, which had already piqued his interest. He quickly closed his notebook and asked calmly. Xia Zixi lowered her head slightly and hesitated while biting her lips. Is she going to say it? Are you saying you don't want to go home, or are you saying you want to adapt in advance so you want to stay with him? Would it be too abrupt? But she has been very abrupt since the first time she saw him, hasn't she? She took a deep breath, slowly closed her eyes, and then gently nodded. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I was scared back into my stomach by the sudden opening of the door from the driver's seat in front of me. After swallowing her saliva, Butler Wu sat back in the car. Miss Xia, Butler Wu turned to his side and said respectfully, "Thank you for your cooperation today. Now we will send you back first." Xia Zixi was stunned for a moment, then nodded with a bitter smile. Along the way, Xia Zixi was thinking about how to speak, but without blinking an eye, the car had once again stopped at Xia's doorstep. After Wu Butler opened the door and got off the car, Xia Zixi realized that the parking was not due to traffic lights. Is it so fast? The car door on the side of her body was opened, and Xia Zixi grabbed her blind cane and slowly moved it out. Along the way, Xu Tingce never opened the computer again, but never received a single answer from her. He turned his head to look at the fallen dead leaves on the roadside outside the window, his lips always heavy. Perhaps her expectations were already insignificant to her. Xia Zixi stood on the roadside, listening to the sound of the car restarting its engine, the sound of the car driving again on the cement ground, and the sound of the car disappearing at the corner. Regret surged up in my heart bit by bit. What is she worrying about? They are all using each other, aren't they? What is there to be afraid of? Now, is she going in? Xia Zixi held on to the blind cane tightly, as if nailed to the roadside, and did not move her steps for a long time. Inside the driving Rolls-Royce Silver Charm, Xu Tingce placed his laptop on the seat beside him, and his mind was filled with a pair of spiritual yet hollow eyes. In the eyes of what should be a stagnant pool, there is a stubborn desire and expectation. But since it's such a stubborn emotion that needs to emerge, why doesn't it even have the courage to defend it? Young master, should we go home or go to the office? Butler Wu looked through the rearview mirror and saw Xu Tingce leaning back on the cushion, resting with his eyes closed. He asked softly. Go to the company, Xu Tingce said in a deep voice. In the Xia family villa, Xia Zixi had already been forcibly dragged into the house by sharp-eyed servants from the road. As soon as she entered the villa, the mixed smell of tobacco and alcohol penetrated her nose and rushed straight to her forehead. Xia Zixi was choked to the point where she covered her nose and kept coughing. The blind cane in his hand was accidentally pulled away by an unknown servant beside him. Xia Zixi slowly swung her arms and gradually moved towards the direction of the staircase as she remembered it. Suddenly, Xia Zixi was forcefully kicked in the back of her knee, and she thrust forward, hitting her head on the stairs. The pain made her forget her anger for a moment. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Begins to learn courage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9 begins to learn courage. Her hair was suddenly grabbed by a force, forcing her to twist her head awkwardly, not knowing where she was looking. Do you still remember what day it is today? Xia Yihan's voice rang in her ears, accompanied by a strong aroma of tobacco and alcohol. Xia Zixi answered with a trembling voice. Today is the anniversary of Xia Yihan's birth mother's death. Every year on this day, she goes crazy once. Xia Langhua was too lazy to come back every day because she couldn't see or be bothered. She couldn't get rid of this madman before. Now she can do it, it just depends on whether she has the courage. A hot pain came from her arm, and Xia Zixi gritted her teeth to endure the pain that was about to overflow from her mouth, moaning, but couldn't break free from her shackles. Go, kneel down in front of my mother's funeral seat. Xia Yihan threw away the cigarette but that had been pressed out on Xia Zixi arm, patted her cheek, and said vaguely, "You, the daughter of the culprit, can't live a better life. Are you going to redeem that slutty old woman for a lifetime?" Xia Zixi's eyes gradually cooled down, and she pushed Xia Yihan away with force. She endured the pain and reached the handrail of the stairs, slowly supporting herself and standing up. "I'm talking to you, are you deaf?" Xia Yihan was already lost in thought, and she stood up swaying left and right, pointing at Xia Zixi's nose and cursing. None of the servants around dared to speak up and stop. After all, in this family, there is no room for Miss Air to speak. They only listen to Mayor Xia and Miss Xia. "My mother is not, you are not allowed to scold her," Xia Zixi said firmly with her back against the escalator. "Are you too brave?" Xia Yihan shook off a group of servants around her and reached out to hold her hand. She increased her strength and patted Xia Zixi's cheek. "Do you think you're going to get married and leave here, so you're not afraid of anything?" "Yes," Xia Zixi answered calmly. "You wouldn't think that man's surname Xu could be your support, would you?" Xia Yihan suddenly laughed wildly. "Do you want to rely on him? Why don't you please me and my mother well? Maybe I will treat you better." "You're dreaming." Xia Zixi spat out words by words, her hands gripping the armrest behind her, desperately suppressing her trembling. "Turn her into my mother's room." Xia Yihan took 2 steps back to make room for the servants around her. Xia Zixi didn't struggle at all and was pulled and thrown into her familiar small room by the servant. She was the only one in the room for the time being, so Xia Zixi climbed up from the ground and reached for the door lock, locking herself inside the room. In the next moment, Xia Zixi immediately softened her legs and slid down the door, sitting on the ground. She trembled as she took out her phone from her pants pocket, pressed the numbers 1, 1, and 0 one by one, and then dialed the phone. "Hello, the police." Xia Zixi suppressed his trembling voice, but his mind was particularly calm. In the underground parking lot of the DYH Asia Pacific Regional Headquarters building in Beijing, a girl of about 7 or 8 years old is rushing towards a car in the middle of the road. The silver sedan was forced to brake urgently and stopped not far from her. Light illuminates the dust in the air and the dirty face of the girl. "I'll go see what's going on," Butler Wu said and immediately got off the car. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Better choose strangers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Better choose strangers. As soon as Butler Wu got off the car, he was hit by a little girl who was full of words like, "Don't go home, don't want dad," and "don't want mom." Immediately after, a drunken man followed and forcefully peeled the little girl off the leg of Butler Wu. The man cursed and slapped the girl's already high and raised cheek with force. The girl cried and struggled while shouting for her mother. And the girl's mother stood next to the driver's seat, watching this scene coldly. Until the family left, Butler Wu couldn't bear to sit back in the passenger seat. How could such a lovely child have such parents? It's really pitiful. Butler Wu couldn't help but feel dissatisfied and indignant. With such parents, a child's life will be unfortunate. Yes, it's really a sin. The driver could not help roast. Look at that child, I would rather hold you as a stranger than give up, rather than go home with her parents. Xu Tingce witnessed all of this, with deep and dark emotions hidden in his pitch-black eyes. After the car stopped in front of the CEO's exclusive elevator seat, Butler Wu opened the car door for Xu Tingce and pressed the elevator ride button for him, waiting for him to board the elevator. After a ding, the elevator door opened. Xu Tingce, however, still stood in place with a slight frown. After a moment, he pondered. "Uncle Wu, go to the Xia family for me." In the Xia family villa, Xia Yihan snatched the spare key from the servant's hand and fiercely smashed open the fragile door. What caught the eye was the dangerous scene of Xia Zixi sitting outside the window, holding Xia Yihan's mother's spirit card. Although there is a swimming pool below, there is still a high possibility of falling and hitting the pool wall, breaking arms and legs. "Miss Eyre, come down quickly. You're going to have your wedding this weekend. If there's any mistake at this time, how can we explain it to the master?" "I can explain." The cool evening breeze dispersed Xia Zixi's faint trembling voice. The wind whistling past her ears blew up the fine strands of hair and goosebumps on her neck. After a year, the darkness in her eyes once again made her heart flustered, trembling, and uneasy. Xia Yihan's eyes were fixed on the spiritual tablet held in Xia Zixi's hand, and her heart gradually burned with anger. She walked over quickly, decisively grabbing the spirit card in Xia Zixi's hand and forcefully grabbing it. "You bastard, why did you touch my mother's plaque?" Xia Yihan roared wildly, using all his brute force. Unexpectedly, Xia Zixi suddenly let go of her hand, causing Xia Yihan to stumble back a few steps and plunge into the arms of the surrounding servants. And Xia Zixi, like being blown down by the wind, disappeared from the window. Outside the window, there was a thumping sound of heavy objects falling into the water, and the splashing water splashed against the blue tiles, making a fine tapping sound. After Xia Yihan realized it, the servants behind her rushed towards the swimming pool in groups, leaving her sitting in the room. Does Xia Zixi want to live anymore? How could it be? Isn't she more afraid of death than anyone else? The sound of the police car honking grew louder and louder, as if it had stopped at her doorstep. Almost at the same moment, Xia Yihan suddenly woke up and got up from the ground, rushing down the stairs. The swimming pool has been surrounded by police personnel. The police officer who rescued Xia Zixi from the swimming pool took the towel handed over by the maid and wrapped it around the thin girl lying in his arms. Finally escaping from the overwhelming suffocation, the autumn wind mixed with the piercing cold pool water caressed her whole body. The coolness seeped into Xia Zixi's bones, causing her to involuntarily tremble and stimulating her pain nerves. End of this chapter.